Thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Tiffany Brown. I'm the manager for Clatsop tonight. We are hosting an online virtual presentation regarding tsunami evacuation routes in Clatsop County. Tomorrow is the Great Shakeout, and while the Great Shakeout drill may not include a tsunami evacuation for every person in Clatsop County, every person in Clatsop County certainly finds themselves in the tsunami inundation zone at some point. So tonight we are pleased to introduce Laura Gable with the Department of Oregon Geology and Mineral Industries, also known as DGOMI. Laura is a geologist with DGOMI. Is that correct? Do you have a more specific title, Laura?
No, geologist is good.
That's great. I've worked with Laura for a number of years on tsunami modeling and mapping up and down the coast, and so we're delighted to have her with us tonight. She'll be reviewing some of the old maps that we're familiar with and then talking a little bit about the new iterations that they've developed as a result of digging in deeper to those maps from 2013, the old orange, green, and yellow maps that we're all familiar with. So with that, I will just mention a couple of housekeeping items. I'd like to mention in advance that though our staff is used to meeting virtually in the last couple of years, it's our first virtual public presentation, and so we ask you to be patient with us. We'll be relying on the chat or raised hands if someone has a question or comment to make. If you can wait until the end of the presentation, that would be great. If it's really makes a lot of sense to ask a question in the middle of the presentation, just throw your hand up or throw a question in the chat. Hannah St. Dennis and I are on the call today supporting Laura during this presentation. At the end, we'll have time for some questions, and Laura will go through. This meeting will be ending promptly at 7 o'clock. We have people on the call that have places they need to be, and we want to be mindful of everyone's time. With that, Laura, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So like Tiffany said, I'm a geologist with DGOMI, and I live in Newport, Oregon, and along with my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Allen, we represent the Coastal Field Office for DGOMI, and we work on a lot of different issues, but obviously tsunami is a pretty major one that we work on. And so again, yeah, like Tiffany said, we work together on a lot of different issues in Clatsop County and statewide relating to tsunami preparedness. And Tiffany asked me to talk about some of the new mapping that we've been doing and around tsunami evacuation specifically. And so she also asked me to do a brief primer on the geology and, you know, what is Cascadia and what we can expect. I'll keep that really brief, and if anybody has follow-up questions, I'm happy to dig as deep as anybody wants to go on any of these topics. As you can imagine, you know, you can get pretty far into the weeds pretty quickly. So I'm going to try and keep it really high level, and then if anyone wants to ask any questions in the chat, maybe we can take a little pause right after the primer and see if anybody wants to talk about the geology a little more, and then we can jump into the mapping. And same with the mapping, honestly, I'm trying to just give you guys an understanding of what we're doing at a very high level, but any one of these is also a topic that could be discussed much further. So feel free to ask questions. I'm also happy to talk to anyone another time via email or phone to have any follow-up. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and get started with the presentation, unless anybody has any questions before we get started. Okay. It would help if I was on the first slide. Okay, so Tiffany, can you see the presentation? Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, so minutes count in preparation for the next great Cascadia earthquake and tsunami. So like I said, this is just an overview of some of the work that is led by Dr. John Allen, my colleague here with DGOMI. He leads the tsunami program for the state of Oregon, along with our counterpart, Althea Rizzo at Oregon Emergency Management. And here I'm just showing a side-by-side of an image from the Japan event in 2011 with a showing of a map of Warrenton in Clatsop County as an example of just showing how much of Warrenton may possibly be inundated by a tsunami. So A brief primer on Cascadia. This cartoon shows a slice of the subduction zone. So we are on the North American plate, and it is being the Juan de Fuca plate, which is a small portion, a small plate off of the Pacific plate, is being subducted underneath the North American plate at a rate of approximately 1.5 inches per year. So that is the rate over time at which these two plates are supposed to be coming together. However, you can see, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. Tiffany, can you see my mouse there? There is the actual contact between the two plates is quite broad. It daylights at the ocean, at the ocean bottom, at what we call the subduction zone here. It's about 30 miles offshore where I am in Newport, Oregon. It's more like 50 to 60 miles on the North Oregon coast and offshore of the Columbia River. It's actually even closer to the coast on the South Oregon coast, which will come into play for tsunami generation when I get to that. But so this red area down here is what they call the stuck zone or the locked zone. And that is why we have not had an earthquake here in quite some time, and why this is an issue that we're playing catch up on as far as both educating the public and also our own understanding of how this works, because we haven't observed this in action the way we have in other subduction zones around the Pacific Rim, like Japan and Chile, Alaska, New Zealand. So this zone, there's just basically so much friction pushing on these two plates that they can't just move past each other smoothly. But ultimately, this strain, this 1.5 inches per year of strain, will accumulate to the point where the zone is no longer strong enough to hold the two plates fixed where they are, and they will move, and that will be the earthquake. It will be released in an earthquake. So like I just sort of mentioned, what happened in Japan in 2011, we see it as a direct analog for what we can expect here. There are obviously going to be some differences in the geology of the subduction zone and the geography, the topography of the landscape, but generally speaking, this is what we can expect to see as far as what the earthquake and tsunami will look like, and what kind of devastation we will expect to see, and also what people knew to do. Japan has been living through these for a long time. They've been documenting these. So there is a culture of awareness. There is a culture of preparedness. There is signage in places. There is education programs in school, and people pass this information from generation to generation. So while it was a devastating disaster and lots of people lost their lives, it was a success. Lots of people knew exactly what to do and promptly evacuated when the earthquake happened, and that saved their lives. And that is the goal that we are working towards. So because we have not observed any of these earthquakes on our own subduction zone, the last earthquake happened in the year 1700, and it took geologists a long time to realize that what they knew was happening in other places was going to happen in the Pacific Northwest as well. And so the goal for scientists was to try to find clues in the landscape to provide information on what past events in Cascadia looked like, and use that information to define a suite of tsunami sources and model that, computer model that, to try to gain an understanding on what the possible range of earthquakes and tsunamis might look like, and map that and put that on maps and let people know where they need to go in the event of an earthquake. So we do this using paleoseismology, which is basically just a study of historical earthquakes, and you can do that by looking at evidence of rapid land level drop, which is called subsidence, in coastal marshes. You can look at that by looking at offshore landslides in the coastal or the ocean bottom sediments called turbidites. And there's a photo of one of these offshore turbidites collected by Dr. Chris Goldfinger at OSU. And over here on the right, again, I could go into a lot of detail about this, but the basic idea is this is 10,000 years along the x-axis, and each bar represents the effective size of a Cascadia earthquake. And so unfortunately, once this data was kind of refined and put in this simple format, it was found that there is no statistically significant pattern to this data. So we cannot look at the 10,000 years of Cascadia activity and say, based on what we've seen, we can extrapolate and expect X, Y, or Z for the next one. What we can say is that there are many more of the smaller earthquakes and there are many fewer of the large earthquakes. And it's basically that relatively simple observation from this data set that led us to define tsunami sources that we use t-shirt sizes for, which perhaps many of you have heard of at this point. It's been a number of years since we started this, 2009. So we use small, medium, large, and extra, extra large. And so extra, extra large means it was the largest earthquake that was considered, and it created the largest tsunami. And it is a very conservative scenario that isn't even actually observed in the 10,000 year record, just quite with this red bar here. But the point being, it captures all the uncertainty in what we don't know, all the variability and the various parameters that may or may not come into play when there is an actual next earthquake and tsunami. So there have been, just as a summary, there have been 19 full margins. That means Northern California all the way up past Oregon, Washington, and Vancouver Island. 19 full margin ruptures in the last 10,000 years. And not shown on this plot, but there are 26 smaller Cascadia earthquakes that have also happened where some portion of it has ruptured, but not the whole thing. And so that's kind of the end of the primer. This is a bit of a busy poster, but the point is, John and I put this together to try to illustrate that Oregon's plan for tsunami, for our tsunami program, is to build a culture of awareness with a goal of everyone who is in Oregon, whether they live here or they're visiting here, they develop an instinctive response. And when the earth shakes, they know what to do. And that involves effort like this and things that Tiffany is doing on a daily basis to try and just educate people. And so I'm going to go into some of the pieces, some of the things that we have done. I'm not going to talk about any of the modeling that we did to create these maps. Again, I'm happy to talk about that if anybody wants to hear more details about that. But basically, a lot of the science, there's more science to be done always, a better understanding, but we have used that modeling and that 10,000 year record of data to map tsunami modeling on the Oregon coast, map tsunami inundation on the Oregon coast. And this poster just kind of illustrates the different efforts that Dogami has been doing over the years, multiple generations of modeling and then new mapping and various regulatory efforts that have come in and out of play over the years, as well as we build this culture of awareness from the local level all the way up to the governmental level. So are there any questions about that before I go into maps, and more maps? Okay. So I just wanted to start with just show a screenshot of our website. This is if you Google Oregon Tsunami Clearinghouse, you will get here to this front page. You also can type OregonTsunami.org, and I have that on a couple of the upcoming slides, that URL. But so this is your one-stop shop for all sorts of stuff, and we're currently working on an Oregon.gov web movement, but we are trying to keep, and we're going to take advantage of that and maybe clean up some of the stuff on our website. But generally speaking, this is where you can come and look up evacuation information, beat the wave, which is what I'm going to talk about next. All sorts of various categories of tabs to go to and look up additional information, a lot of links from other websites as well. But so the maps that I'm going to talk about are all available for free for download from our website. So hopefully, as Tiffany said, you are all familiar with the cartoon orange, yellow, and green evacuation brochure. So at the end of this big push to model these t-shirt sizes of tsunamis, an advisory council was built coastwide. So it wasn't just a state agency making these decisions, but we worked with both locals as well as other state officials on what to do, what tsunami scenario to use on evacuation maps, and how to illustrate that. And this is what was decided upon. The orange is actually a distant tsunami, which is when one of those other subduction zones around the Pacific Rim has their own earthquake and tsunami. That tsunami will travel across the Pacific and reach our shores at some future time, and there won't be an earthquake, and it will be a much smaller event. It is still an event worth preparing for, but it's just a very different event altogether. And so it's decided upon to use, we did model an earthquake and tsunami coming from Alaska, because that is our nearest neighbor for a subduction zone. It takes about 4 hours for the tsunami to originate on the Aleutians and travel to the Oregon coast. Japan's, just for your information, took about 12 hours to travel across the Pacific and reach Oregon. So our original maps, I'm showing an example of Warrenton, which the Warrenton evacuation map was like 2 feet by 3 feet across, maybe, folded down into a brochure, and obviously covers the whole of Clatsop Plains in addition to Warrenton and Hammond. And so as such, it was at a scale that we have learned through the years through predominantly our work with coastal emergency managers, that it's, while wonderful, it did not provide the resolution that allowed people to really start preparing for their own personal evacuation plans. And so I'm showing on the right here what we're calling neighborhood scale evacuation maps. It's the same data, nothing has changed, but they are zoomed in much closer, and they're built on 8.5 by 11, so they can be printed at home. They are in color still, of course, but so that is one thing that is available online, and you can go, and I'm going to show you our online viewer in a minute, but you can get this information for, I think, almost everywhere on the coast, definitely in Clatsop County. It's all available, and so you can go and download these and use them to help build your plans, and use them to look with a much higher resolution at where you are interested in within the tsunami zone. So once we had done all this work, back in 2009 to 13, and then made these brochures, we feel like we have a really good understanding of where the tsunami is going to be affecting people. But we really wanted to dig into, now that we know where that is, what are we going to do to help people actually evacuate? What are the details of evacuation? So we know where people need to, we know where people need to leave from, but where are they going? What's the best way to get there? What are going to be the impediments to getting there? And so that spawned this effort that we call Beat the Wave. And this is work where we go into a single community, and it's a GIS computer-based effort. And what we are doing is taking the roads and pathways and trails and the inundation zone that we know, and we're saying, okay, what are people's best bet to get out of here? And how fast do they need to go to get to these places? Because we have information from all of that sophisticated modeling on arrival times for the tsunami. And that arrival time is very different for different communities. In Clatsop County, like I said, Clatsop County is pretty far. The tsunami has to go about 50 to 60 miles to reach the coast, so it takes more time. But there's even nuances in when and how the wave arrives. Say at the beach, it takes time for the tsunami to reach. This is a map of Seaside, South Seaside. It reaches the beach in, I should have looked this up before the talk, but roughly 25 minutes after the start of earthquake shaking. And it takes about 10 minutes for it to flow across the landscape and reach the hills behind Seaside to the east. So it takes some time. And so that information, we incorporate that into this Beat the Wave modeling, evacuation modeling. And what we get from it, so when you have a distance to safety and a speed that you need, or in a time that you need to be there by, a time and a distance, you can derive a speed. And so we use this information to build these speed maps. So they have routing information, which way to go for the most efficient route to safety, as well as how fast you need to go. And, we've been keeping messaging very simple. We just want people to understand the basics of you're in or you're out of the tsunami zone, and if you're in, you need to get out. But in some cases, and we say, walk to high ground, but in some cases, there are places that are far enough from high ground that you actually need to travel at something beyond a walk. And we think that's really valuable information for people to have available to them so they can start really planning their evacuation. So we've been doing this work up and down the coast. We are almost completely done. And what we have since been doing is figuring out how to present this information. It's obviously, we're putting them out in technical reports. I work really hard on them, and only a few people read them usually. So we've been working on these maps. So we teamed up with the University of Oregon's Infographics Lab to take all of my information, and they distilled it into something that was understandable, absorbable, aesthetically pleasing, all things that as a scientist are not my forte. And this is what they came up with. And so again, these are available on our website. There's a whole Beat the Wave section of the website. So if you just Google Oregon Tsunami Beat the Wave, you'll get there. And you can download these maps for every community on the coast. So it's not in every unpopulated part of the coast. I did this for the communities. And this one showing Seaside, I wanted to show Seaside because there's a couple details of this effort that I think really highlight its effectiveness, or where it can be really effective. So in Seaside, there are bridges that people must cross in order to reach safety. And some of those bridges have been retrofitted, meaning rebuilt, in a way that we expect them to survive the earthquake shaking and to be available for people to use to evacuate. Others have not. And some are in various levels, various ages and levels, conditions, and will probably not be passable after the earthquake. And so we incorporate that into our evacuation modeling to look at what the ideal routes are, assuming those bridges are not available. And so we make a point in our final maps to make that very clear, which bridges are quite likely to fail. We can't say for sure, but the point to be conservative, you assume they're not available. If they are available and you can see a way across, wonderful. Also, we're only using the roads themselves, and we strongly encourage people to reach their nearest high ground, even if that is not on a road, but that makes it much harder to display on a map. So one thing that Beat the Wave can really do is really highlight vulnerabilities that come from whether or not a bridge is available or not, because it really can make routes much longer. And when you just look at a regular map, even if you can tell yourself that a certain bridge maybe isn't available, you just see it and you're going to think, because you drive over it all the time. If you live in that town, you're going to think it's available. Another thing that Beat the Wave we think is a really helpful tool is we call evacuation flow zone. So you can see there's a boundary right here, and everyone north of this line should head north and then east across the Broadway Bridge and First Avenue Bridge up here. And anyone who is south of this line in Seaside, in the southern neighborhood off the prom there, they should head south to Tillamook Head. And so there's a dividing line. So it just starts to provide additional information on what zone am I in, what neighborhood am I in, where should I be aiming to get to, even if I don't follow the exact routing that this map advises me to take. I know I live in this area, so my nearest high ground is Tillamook Head. This is an interesting spot. It's been kind of assumed I've learned that people just assume they need to head east quite often. And east, there is high ground to the east, but it's quite difficult to get to. And Tillamook Head is closer, but it may not be the most intuitive thing for people. So to put it on a map so that you can really study it, take a look at it, think about it. And then also, so I was mentioning the speed, the infographics team at U of O helped us come up with a way to effectively communicate how fast people must go. And so they came up with these 3 shades of purple. So the lightest purple is the walk, and the medium purple is a jog, and the darkest purple is a run. Now, there isn't the darkest purple on this map, which means that nowhere in this part of southern Seaside do we think you actually have to run. Now, there are miles per hour associated with these, but here in this case, when you're in this part of town, centrally located here, you must jog, and you must jog all the way to safety. So it does, a light arrow joins into the darker purple arrow at the end of the neighborhood as you start to travel past, I forget what this area is called, but where the folks surf. But if you are anywhere up here, you must maintain that speed the whole way. So they helped us design a map where the purple, whichever purple is near where you start your route, that's the line you follow all the way in. But if you happen to be further south when the earthquake hits and you see both colors on your map, you pick the lightest one. You can actually reach high ground at a walk. It doesn't mean you shouldn't travel faster if you are able, but it communicates this, it just provides another level of information on what will be an impediment to reaching safety in time. So there's just an added risk the further away you are from high ground. Oh, and I like to call these evacuation maps 2.0. They still are just showing the tsunami zone, but now there's a lot more information within the tsunami zone that was not there originally. So depending on how complicated of a message you want to send to someone, you can still show them the evacuation brochure versus sending them to this more complicated but more illuminating map. So again, like I said, we've done these everywhere. Here's just two more examples of print maps. So I did one for Fort Stevens State Park, and here's one for Jeffers Garden. And again, a place like Jeffers Garden, I was kind of surprised when I saw the results of my work. And again, I know it's not super zoomed in, but basically I thought Jeffers Garden would be all the walk, the lightest purple everywhere. Communities within the Columbia River estuary have even more time. The tsunami has to come into the river and it takes more time. And so Beat the Wave tends to show that people can reach high ground at a walk more often than not. But Jeffers Ground does have only one kind of road that goes off the low-lying floodplains of Young's Bay and up to high ground. And so they end up, there's quite a bit of the neighborhood that actually needs to jog to get to high ground in time. So all of this kind of culminated, and we made these maps. We put a lot of effort into those beautiful purple maps, but we know that everybody's on their phones and their computers. And so we put a lot of effort into, also with the University of Oregon's infographics lab and another lab there that specializes in geospatial data, to get this stuff online. So hopefully you're all familiar with the online evacuation zone viewer, which we've had for many years now. And it shows the same information that's on the evacuation maps, the orange for the distant, yellow for the XXL, the local tsunami, and green means safety. All the same information. And you can click on the map or punch in an address. But what we've been doing for the last few years is taking our Beat the Wave data and getting it in there. So now when you click on a location or you punch in an address, not only does it tell you whether you're in or out of the tsunami zone, but it provides a Google Maps style route with turn-by-turn instructions over here on the right and information on how fast you need to walk, how far it is to get to high ground, where the nearest safety destination is, so a specific address. So high ground in this case for this example is up Broadway, and it shows you where the bridges are assumed to be unavailable and which bridges are assumed to be available and can be used for evacuation. And I was talking about those boundaries between different areas to safety. So you can even communicate, instead of a really detailed turn by turn, you can just say, oh, I'm in the zone that needs to head east up Broadway versus I'm to the south and I need to head south towards Tillamook Head. So those boundaries are shown on this map as well. And now John has developed what's called the snapshot tool. And so you can actually save any address and the routes that come with it. And you can send that. So you can send a page that would look like this, minus the text, of course. You could send that to someone else. So you could do the work for someone else if you're trying to make entry into tsunami evacuation as easy as possible. You could create a route for them and create a snapshot and send them a short URL, and would take them right to this website and right to showing that route to safety. And we also can print. You can choose to make a custom brochure, and you can take a snapshot of this information and make it a map. You can print it. So you can get here. This website is not hosted by Oregon.gov, but you can find it You can find a link to it from OregonTsunami.org, our main website. You can get to it in several different ways. And so that's the end of the mapping stuff. And it's 6:30. And so I wondered if anybody had any questions. I will say that I also wanted to talk about some of the work that Dogami has been doing specifically in Clatsop County at a really high level. Again, I just wanted to provide provide a little bit of what it is that we've been doing in other counties as well. But since this is a Clatsop County talk, I am focusing on what we've been doing specifically in Clatsop County.
Great. Laura, we have a question from Dr. Wayne. Dr. Wayne, go ahead.
Unmuted? Am I unmuted now? Yeah. Could you put that address, or that site, in the chat box maybe, so we can all have it?
Thank you. That's a great idea. Tiffany, can you do that?
You bet, I will. I also wanted to mention, I know it's so wonderful that we can print these maps now, and that they're smaller and more manageable, but I wanted to let some of the cooperators and even the citizens on the call know that we actually have glossy pre-printed versions of the Beat the Wave maps and the original tsunami inundation maps at the Clatsop County Emergency Management Office. We have all the neighborhood maps that were created for Beat the Wave. So if anybody's interested in getting those maps, please don't hesitate to contact us.
Thank you, Tiffany. That was perfect. And actually, I did hit on that in this slide. So this is a very high level summary of kind of a lot of stuff that we've been working on for years and years. Signage is obviously so important because not everybody is coming to talks or choosing to go to websites to look at what their evacuation plan could be. Obviously, there's a lot of people that are just going to be here when it happens, whether they live on the coast or they are visiting for the weekend, and signage is going to be the key to their survival. The earthquake is going to happen and they're going to look for what to do, and if there are signs saying walk this way, obviously that's going to be worth a lot. So that's where a lot of emergency managers have been putting their effort, and understandably so. And so through the National Tsunami Program, year after year, we have been putting in, as a part of our proposals, funding for brochures like Tiffany just mentioned. We try to get money to print, our new Beat the Wave brochures, the original evacuation brochures, the new neighborhood scale evacuation maps, as much as we can, printed to hand out at events, readiness fairs, that sort of thing. Also various kinds of signage on the ground. So we have, Clatsop County did some of this on their own as well. There's been a variety of funding sources for this sort of work, but posting evacuation map type information with a "You Are Here" sticker at various locations, at popular beach access points, public parking lots, etc. We've also helped fund Blue Lines, which is a process where you use, I can't think of the name for it right now, but you put thermoplastic, same as what's put on like double yellow lines on major roads, across where you have crossed out of the tsunami inundation zone. So it's both informative for an evacuation and also sort of education ahead of time. As people are walking and driving in these communities, they're seeing these blue lines that say you are now leaving the tsunami zone. And that's a photo of the blue line that was put up by the new Seaside High School a couple of years ago. That photo was taken, and now they just officially did the ribbon cutting for the new Seaside School, way out of the tsunami zone. A really big win for the coast. Here's kind of a brief list. So we have these "You Are Here" maps all over the place that we have funded and developed. The blue lines, like I mentioned, we've also just printed out a lot of generic blue routing arrows of different kinds for different communities. Also, we have updated all the "You Are Entering" and "You Are Leaving the Tsunami Zone" for Highway 101 for the entire state. That took a couple of years to do. That had been done already, but with the new modeling, some of those locations had changed and many of those signs had been stolen. So it was a collaboration between Dogami and the counties and the cities to get these new signs up everywhere, and that is done now. And like Tiffany and I were just talking about, lots of brochures, printing out evacuation maps and beat the wave maps. Just to hit on a couple projects we've done in Clatsop County specifically. So Beat the Wave, which we're using for all of these evacuation routing. We, in red here, just shows basically we've done almost all of Clatsop County has evacuation routing available online and on the maps, all the way from Arch Cape and Cannon Beach, all the way up through, Seaside, Gearhart, Clatsop Plains, Hammond, Warrenton, and Astoria. And this coming year, we're going to tie up loose ends and do Beat the Wave in the communities along the Columbia River upstream of Astoria. And that will complete, along with, I'm doing Brookings and Harbor way down I'm doing the very top and the very bottom of the state at the same time, which will probably be confusing for myself, but that will complete the whole state. We will have the whole state mapped for evacuation routing for a local tsunami zone. We also, in the last couple of years, we've been turning our attention to the maritime communities and educating them and learning what we might be able to expect tsunamis and how they will interact with ports and harbors and vessels of all sizes. So this has been, again, a collaboration with the Navy and the Coast Guard and the commercial fishing fleets and emergency managers to put out some maritime response guidance. And we did a specific effort for the Columbia River. And that is a technical report that you can find in the maritime section of our website. And we've been doing this in some other ports as well, the major ports on the Oregon coast. And also, this is on the right here is a smaller thing, but I've been working with the emergency manager of Cannon Beach on using my Beat the Wave data to make figures that specifically highlight the importance of a bridge over Ecola Creek. And Rick Hudson used some of that data in his proposals to FEMA to fund an effort at reinforcing that bridge, building a new pedestrian bridge, some sort of way to ensure evacuation can happen over that bridge, because it will allow people in downtown Cannon Beach access to a much closer high ground than they have now currently if they cannot cross the bridge. So that's been a really nice example of where Beat the Wave is actually being used to justify some sort of mitigation project for a community.
Laura, we have a couple questions in the chat right now. We've got a question from Florence that I think I'll take, asking about rubble and roadways. She asks, will the roads and pavement be broken up? Will we be clambering up hills, or can we walk? Will there be any supplies at assembly points? Florence, we do expect the roads and pavement to be disrupted, not necessarily in such a way that you won't be able to walk or navigate it in that way. Will there be supplies at assembly points? Not if you are identifying assembly points as the A's indicated on the map. When we created those maps, we identified them as high ground, and to this point, there aren't supplies. Those are really only identified as high ground. It's true that some of the cities have supplies in their cities, but they don't necessarily correspond with the A's on the map.
Can you tell us where they might be in Astoria? The supplies?
The supplies are managed by the cities themselves, and so that would be a question to contact the city about.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet, thank you. Laura, second, we have Kate asking about how liquefaction impacts evacuation times. She says, I'm curious if liquefaction potential might change evacuation times. I live in one of the more vulnerable areas of Seaside and would have to cross 2 bridges.
Both great questions, and exactly what I was thinking. You know, I could get into a lot of detail on some of the nuances that we thought of. So the first question about liquefaction, and to Florence's question about rubble on the roads, you know, Beat the Wave is a community-wide exercise, and we only were able to take a broad brush look at how whether or not the roadways that I'm just modeling a distance to safety, you know, it's not going to be a walk in the park. It's not the, you know, the concrete, the asphalt will likely be broken up. Either, you know, passage will be blocked by fallen debris, trees and power lines and whatever else, as well as liquefaction, which is an earthquake phenomenon where saturated sediments liquefy under shaking conditions and can cause either like sand and mud and water to kind of erupt from underneath the, you know, underneath the ground surface and dump all that on the surface. And if you look at photos of Christchurch, the 2015 New Zealand earthquake, you'll see some really good photos of that kind of liquefaction. Also, you can imagine like the 1964 earthquake in Alaska had lateral spreading as well as liquefaction very famously, and it caused really large crevasses to open up in like the town of Valdez, and so, you know, that both of those kind of things can happen, and those will obviously interrupt evacuation, which must happen on foot. We do not anticipate being able to get very far in a car, so our official messaging is not to try and use a vehicle to evacuate, to do it on foot. But will it block roadways completely? In most cases, no. In some cases, maybe. But it's just, that's so site specific, and liquefaction in particular is such a site specific hazard. It doesn't blanket a place everywhere. It's really site specific, like, you know, a couple, you know, 50 meters here, 100 meters there, and then nothing at all. And so there was just no way to really account for that at that level of resolution. But what I was able to do was, in the technical reports for each community for Beat the Wave, I do talk about liquefaction. And what I do is, one of the details of liquefaction is I assign road surfaces a value of how easy they are to walk across. And so a paved road gets a value of 1. It's really easy to walk on a flat road. And then the other end member is walking through soft sand, as you all know, is much more difficult. It takes more energy. And so that gets a value of 2.1, which doesn't need to mean anything, but basically, you know, I'm adding I'm punishing a road for being harder to walk on, and that gets incorporated into these final speeds that you see. And I do a scenario where I assign all the paved roads that are susceptible to liquefaction with that soft sand value instead of the paved road value. And as you can imagine, it makes those Beat the Wave travel speeds increase, because you're losing more energy to the effort it takes to walk across an uneven surface. But there's a lot, that's the thing is, you know, these are sort of all of Beat the Wave. It's meant to be, again, sort of a first line of defense to get people thinking about what their route should be and walking it, and then planning like, well, okay, we've done it, and we think this is sort of a difficult spot, or what's on this map isn't quite right for us because we know the area better, or we can cut across this park. Or it's just to get you thinking and thinking about how fast you're able to travel and what could help you be able to travel faster, having things packed up ahead of time, different details like that.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Kate's question was actually two-part, and she asked, secondly, has there been consideration of folks with disabilities during evacuation? For example, estimated times for people in a wheelchair. I remember when you and I first started doing this work together, you talked to me about the walking speed with which you use as a foundation. How does that compare? How does that typical crosswalk speed that we talk about when we look at maps and whatnot compare to a wheelchair? Was that anything you looked into?
Yeah, a little bit. So, you know, so these pretty, we call these the pretty Beat the Wave maps. The maps in the technical reports, which I made, I was told they were not so pretty. I think they're very pretty, but they're much busier because they show more speed classifications. And so what Tiffany's referring to is 4 feet per second is what we learned through doing this work, is the speed that is used to calculate how long to have a pedestrian crosswalk go at a red light. So based on the distance that people will have to cross a street, they use 4 feet per second, which is I forget what miles per hour that is, 1.4 miles per hour or 2.7 miles per hour, but relatively slow. And it's meant to be a speed that represents even folks with some ambulatory disability to be able to cross the street. And so the more technical versions of these maps show the 0 to 2 feet per second, which is the slowest speeds needed, and then the 2 to 4, which is, and it's both of those combined that show the lightest purple on the pretty maps, the walk. And so, yeah, anyone, 4 feet per second is that ambulatory disability speed that is used for crosswalks and things like that. And that is incorporated. Now, as to specifically, like wheelchair or assistance for evacuation for folks with ambulatory difficulties, or even, blind and deaf, and, all of those things will obviously increase difficulty in evacuation, but that is not addressed in Beat the Wave. And that's really, both a personal issue for people to be thinking about, and then working with their city or county to talk about what other services are available.
I think it also brings up the point that we can't make enough, which is, regardless of your situation, if you're planning evacuation, the importance is to practice. I presented today to the Coast Guard and I said, practice at night, practice when it's raining, practice when you're not planning to practice. And I think with respect to Kate's question, that's a great place to start, is just to get out and start to understand what that route looks like on a blue sky day, to start understanding what modifications might be needed under more difficult circumstances.
That's a great point too, yeah. Was there more to the question? I can't remember.
Florence is back on liquefaction, and she's asking, and I don't know if there's one answer, but it's, how long does it take for liquefaction to harden again? What's the process for that? She asks, are life jackets needed? I think of it more as a quicksand environment, but what can you say to that, Laura?
Yeah, it will stop happening as soon as the earth stops shaking, but whatever it leaves on the surface will remain, which is why it won't be quicksand when you're trying to evacuate across it. Once you evacuate across it, the earthquake is done when you're evacuating, and it's more likely just going to be standing water with like mud and sand in it and an uneven surface that you're stumbling across. So it's mostly just going to be an inconvenience, it's not going to be a life jacket type situation at all, except in perhaps some very specific locations, like if you're clamming on a mud flat when it happens, but in town, on our roads, that sort of thing, it won't be a life jacket situation. It'll just be very messy, uneven ground in some spots and not in others.
Thank you. I was really worried about that. Okay.
We recognize that there's still a lot we don't know. We've been doing a lot of work around liquefaction, not just Ogami, but in general, USGS scientists, and John specifically has recognized the importance of understanding it at a more refined level for this very question. We get it all the time, and we think it's a good question to ask too. And we think that there is more work that can be done, and it would need to be done site specifically. Like, we would need to acquire funding and experts in the field to look at liquefaction in a single community and look at their geology, their soils, their water table, and all of those details that go into how liquefaction can manifest. There are liquefaction data sets out there, including some done by Dogami, that are getting better, but they're still pretty broad stroke, and liquefaction is just so site specific. I did, back to the ambulatory difficulties. So I had talked about some of the work that we've been doing, but there were 2 other projects that weren't on that summary slide. And one of them, this is a technical thing that we did, and it was really more for planners than for the general public. But I still think that people that are engaged on this topic would find this very interesting. So we did what's called we called it an impact analysis. So we used, FEMA has a tool called HAZIS, and it basically will analyze how a natural disaster can impact a community both financially and all the consequences of the event. So information that they can use to develop, plans and strategies to deal with the hazard. So we're talking about casualties, in fatalities and injuries, and building damage and debris. Somebody asked about rubble, and so we use this tool, this HAZUS tool, to do what we call an impact analysis for Clatsop County, and it is on our website. You can look for it there. It has its open file report O-20-10. But again, if you look up earthquake Clatsop County, you'll get there pretty fast. And so again, so we break out who lives in the tsunami zone, what kinds of people, how many people over 65, what ratio of the town's population is inside the tsunami zone. We look at estimates of the cost of building damage, building replacement costs, how much debris might be needed to be moved and managed after the event, injuries and fatalities, like I said, listing out key infrastructure like bridges and fire stations and police and school that are in the tsunami zone, and then also, as much as is available, details about who is in these communities, and that includes ambulatory disabilities as defined in the census data, and as well as like languages spoken at home, because we think a lot about the non-English speaking households and making sure that they have all of this information as well. And so this is a report that you can go look up online, and this coming year, actually, we've now finished the coast for these analyses. We're doing one coast at one county at a time, and we're going to put out a coast-wide summary this year and try to look for patterns and really hit the highlights to, not bore people with the details and just have them recognize what's really important. But so this is just an example. Even this, I won't go into details, but there's just various pieces of information about like the percentage of people in the tsunami zone, distances to safety based on where you are in this area. This is an example for Warrenton. And we did these for not just XXL, because XXL is the most conservative. It also is the largest and kind of causes the most trouble. And the smaller t-shirt sizes, namely large, are much more likely to be what we experience next, as opposed to an XXL, sort of like a 100-year flood versus a 10-year flood. We expect to experience more 10-year floods than 100-year floods. That's changing a little bit, unfortunately. But so this is an example of we have these in this report for medium, large, and extra, extra large for every community in the county, and you can flip through them and look at different metrics. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that's out there, and we break out, how many people have ambulatory difficulties and what those are as they're self-reported in the census data. So that is out there. And I did, before we end, I guess, I did want to throw out, we are also, and this, my screen sharing hack broke for this one. Okay, so another project that we are working on in FY22, so we're going to start it this month actually, is looking at vertical evacuation structures in high priority locations. So vertical evacuation structures are when high ground is too far away, you bring high ground to where the people are. I'm using, I put a photo on of the newest one that's been built. It's up in Tokeland, Washington. It was funded in part by FEMA, in part by the tribe. I believe there was additional funds from the state. No, I'm not sure actually. But anyway, we recognize that there are many sites on the Oregon coast that could do with one or more of these. And Clatsop County has a number of these potential sites. The Clatsop Plains, Seaside, Gearhart, even Warrenton, there's a lot of places. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be following the approach and lessons learned from our counterparts in Washington State who have just finished this project. And I have a highlight of that right here. This is a report that you can find on Washington DNR's website, where they use basically a combo of beat the wave type work as well as the HAZUS type work. So you have both distances to safety, and you have an understanding of who is in these zones and where they are and which age groups are where, and then playing around with putting vertical evacuation structures in multiple sites. And what are the best sites? Where do you get the most bang for your buck in these communities? How many? And where could they realistically go where the city or the county owns property, trying to get at it from all angles. So this is the project we are starting. We're going to be doing it in just a few communities to start. We're going to put together a advisory council, and we're going to make sure that the whole coast and the different groups are represented. This is a really collaborative effort with OEM, Oregon Emergency Management, the counties, DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development. They're helping with this work, and all sorts of emergency responders. And we're going to just start chipping away at doing this work, which will then be a shelf-ready plan for, say, Tiffany to go to FEMA and say, we really want these 10 vertical evacuation structures in Clatsop County. And here is justification. Here is proof, quantified proof of like how many lives we can save if we have 1, if we have 2, if we have 4. So that's the goal, is to be providing information for the planners to be able to use in pursuing this in the future. So that's something we're really excited about doing.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think we're all excited about that. And at the last Tsunami Advisory meeting, I think we talked about the next steps in that assessment process, right? Just even looking up and down the coast at where those potential locations are. It's about 4 minutes. It's about 4 minutes to the hour. And I know that we're on a strict timeline tonight. And so I want to just, if you weren't looking at the clock, Laura, make you aware that we're almost done. Ask if you have any final comments.
Well, I want to thank all of you for tuning into this and asking questions especially. And please feel free to email me or call me with any questions. I'm looking for if I shared my email, and I did not, but here's my name, and you can contact me at laura.gable@oregon.gov. Maybe Tiffany could throw that in the chat really quick. I'm sorry that wasn't on a slide. But yeah, just like Tiffany said, our goal is to get people engaged and thinking about their evacuation and practicing it. And we hope that Beat the Wave is another way to reduce the activation energy it takes to do this work. We're trying to do as much of it for people as possible, and determining routes and is a really big step forward, we think. And we really hope that people utilize this information and share it with friends and family. I also didn't mention from the website, we have apps for the phone for this as well. It's not just a URL for the web. So yes, thank you for coming in, for asking questions and being engaged. And remember that Shakeout is tomorrow at 10:20 a.m. Everyone will be drop covering and holding in unison to raise awareness.
That's great. So I'm going to wrap up. I've put Laura's contact information in the chat. I put the department information for my agency in the chat. If you have any questions, I want to remind you that we have these maps available physically printed. If you're a citizen that's here tonight and would like for me to mail you a map, I'm happy to do that. I wanted to just end by saying that to thank Laura so much for the presentation tonight, and to also invite any feedback on this presentation. The format, was the information useful? We're looking at ways that we can broaden our outreach and education in Clatsop County, and the virtual platform is one of them, but we want to be good at that, and we want to be delivering what people want to hear. So if you have suggestions or feedback about how this went tonight, how you'd like to see it in the future, or how you think we could improve on this idea, we'd love to hear from you. With that, I'm going to ask for any last questions. And seeing none, I'm going to thank everybody again for coming, and I'll let you know that the recording will be posted on the website within the next day or two, and we'll post that prominently on the homepage of Clatsop County Emergency Management. Laura, I did have one quick question, and I know the answer is that we don't have the maps in Spanish, but are there any resources available for non-English speakers with respect to tsunami inundation education?
We have some information available through our website. It's not Dogami's information, but we we are trying to, the evacuation maps have Spanish on the backside. Everything is in both languages, or most information is in both languages on the evacuation brochures. But there is a section on our website that links to a lot of Spanish speaking material out there at other websites, but it is definitely an area for improvement.
Agreed. I would also point anyone interested back to the Clatsop County website. We just wrapped up a 6-week Ready campaign where we walked people through efforts to get prepared over a course of 6 weeks. And for every week, there was a Spanish page. They didn't always match perfectly, but I think we did a pretty good job of getting the same information up in Spanish and English. So I'd encourage anybody to go to the county website and look for those resources as well. We actually found a lot of good resources this week for Cascadia,